The island of Sardinia in the western Mediterranean is known to many as a resort where the sea, sun, and mountains create pastoral landscapes. But beneath this calm facade lies one of the strangest and most underrated civilizations of ancient Europe. A civilization that existed long before Rome. It left not a single line of written records, yet covered the entire island with thousands of stone towers called Nuraghis. This civilization existed for more than 1,000 years. It survived the collapse of the Bronze Age and traded with Mycenae and the Eastern Mediterranean. And yet it never became an empire. So, who were the Nuragic people really? Why did they build these giant towers? How was their society organized and why did it disappear? As always, I'm glad to welcome all viewers of the Amazing History channel. Thank you for watching, commenting, and supporting our videos. Special thanks to our sponsors and channel members. It's thanks to you that we can regularly release big, detailed stories about civilizations that rarely make it into textbooks. If you're interested in deep and honest history without myths or cliches, you're in the right place. And now, let's begin. At the beginning of my story, it's important to understand one simple thing. The appearance of all these towers that now cover the entire island is the result of a very long prehistory. Long before the first Nuraghis, the island was literally carved out of stone. Hundreds of tombs were cut into the rocks. Today they are called Domus de Janus, the houses of fairies, but in essence, these were underground dwellings for the dead. They were made over the centuries, and many of them date back to the Ozieri culture period. They were complex chambers, sometimes with several rooms, replicating the layout of a real house. This is an important detail because death here was not something temporary or secondary. It was built into the landscape and into the mindset of the people. Even then, Sardinia was not a unified world. In different parts of the island, people buried their dead differently, built differently, and apparently lived by their own rules. There was no center and no ancient capital. Only communities that knew their land and where their dead were. This habit of fragmentation would survive for thousands of years and become one of the main features of the Nuragic era. Around the 3rd millennium BC, the island began to change. People increasingly left the rocks behind and began using open spaces. Archaeologists associate this transitional stage with the Monte Claro culture, the appearance of open-air settlements, fortified areas, and the first massive walls. These were not yet new, but it was already the mindset of people who saw the landscape as a space that could be managed. At the same time, the island was becoming more deeply integrated into Mediterranean networks. Sardinia possessed an important resource, volcanic obsidian. In an era when metals were still rare and expensive, obsidian was almost the perfect material. It breaks with jewel-like precision, making blades sharper than most metal knives of that time. Arrowheads and spear tips, knives, scrapers, and surgical instruments were made from it, but it was valued not only for its practicality. Obsidian sources were rare, so every piece immediately revealed its origin. Stone from Sardinia can still be recognized even today, and archaeologists find it in Sicily, southern France, and the Apennines. This made obsidian the perfect trade commodity. Control over such a resource gave access to trade routes, partners, and influence. That's why, long before the Nuragic towers, Sardinia was already part of the greater Mediterranean world. Later, metal was added to obsidian. First copper, then the first bronze items. That was already a high level. A society that understood the value of technology and knew how to master it. During this period, pottery styles and burial traditions appeared in Sardinia. Related to the bell beaker culture, which was widespread at that time in Western and Central Europe, but the island did not become a copy of it. It definitely borrows certain elements, reinterprets them, and incorporates them into its own tradition. Thus, by the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC, Sardinia was no longer an isolated island. Its society had experience in large-scale construction, trade, and resource management. One more step remained to be taken. To stop building only for the dead, and to start building for the living. Again, the transition from underground tombs to above-ground structures was not instantaneous. It took several centuries and began around the end of the 3rd, beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. It was at this time that the first structures appeared in Sardinia, which archaeologists call Proto-Nuraghi. These are not yet the classic towers that are associated with the Nuragic civilization today. Proto-Nuraghi look squat, sometimes asymmetrical, without a clear tower shape. They resemble massive stone platforms or fortresses built into the landscape. They were built on elevations, on hillsides, and in locations that offered a good view of the surrounding area. These structures were no longer hidden underground, but instead they prominently rose above the landscape. It was as if they were saying that people live here, on this land, and it is under their control. According to archaeological data, the Proto-Nuraghis were associated with everyday life. Traces of agriculture, animal husbandry, and crafts are found around them. And inside there are bones of domestic animals, grain, and hearths. These were not temples or palaces in the usual sense, but rather community centers where economic, social, and probably ritual functions came together. At the same time, it's important to note one thing. Proto-Nuraghis did not appear in just one place or according to a single plan. They were built in different regions of the island. In some places these were massive walls, and in others they were complex multi-level structures. This again tells us that Sardinia did not have a single state or centralized authority. Instead, there was an entire network of autonomous communities connected by trade, culture, and a common architectural language. By the beginning of the early Bronze Age, Sardinia had already taken a decisive step. Stone structures were no longer an experiment and had become a stable practice. It was during this period that the construction of nuraghis became a widespread phenomenon. Hundreds of new structures appeared all over the island. Archaeologists count at least 150 early nuraghis built in just a few centuries. The early nuraghis are still relatively simple in shape. Most often, these are massive squat towers with thick walls, inner chambers, and narrow entrances. They were built from large, unworked blocks without mortar, but with remarkably precise stone fitting. These structures do not look decorative. They give an impression of stability and deliberate durability. It's also important where they were built. The nuraghis occupied strategic locations, natural elevations, hills, and plateaus. From them, there was a view of fields, pastures, roads, and valleys. And this was no accident, because by that time, Sardinian society had become more densely populated. And consequently, competition for resources was becoming more and more intense, and land, livestock, and communication routes needed not just to be used, but also to be controlled. If you think that the nuraghis of the early Bronze Age are something like medieval castles, that's not quite the case. Everything indicates that the towers were integrated into the economic system. They served as focal points for communities, places where life was concentrated, not just defense. At the same time as before, Sardinia remained fragmented. There were no signs of a unified construction plan or centralized authority. Each community built its own tower based on local conditions and needs. The island's economy was based on agriculture and livestock farming. Fields, pastures, and water resources around the nuraghis were used continuously. Archaeological findings show a mixed economic model, where grain cultivation was combined with raising large and small livestock. This provided a stable food base and allowed part of the population to engage not only in food production, but also in crafts and trade. It is here that metal comes to the forefront. Nuragic Sardinia becomes one of the prominent centers of bronze metallurgy in the Western Mediterranean. Copper and especially tin, the key component of bronze, become a strategic resource and gradually replace obsidian. Everyone needed metal, which means that whoever controls its extraction and processing gains influence far beyond their own region. This influence is clearly seen in the findings. Objects of Sardinian origin have been discovered in southern France, on the Iberian Peninsula, and in North Africa. In the opposite direction, items that clearly could not be local ended up on the island. Among them were ceramics and metal products from the Eastern Mediterranean. It is also important how this trade was organized. We still do not see a single trading center or a dominant port. Different areas of the island participated in the exchange in different ways, specializing in various resources and crafts. Some controlled metal, others agriculture, and still others the coastal routes. Economic growth gradually begins to be reflected in the architecture itself. Some nuraghis start to stand out in size and complexity. Larger settlements begin to form around them. These were not capitals in the usual sense, but rather centers of attraction where resources, people, and power converged. The paradox of Nuragic history is that its peak coincides with one of the most severe crises of the ancient world. Between the 13th and 10th centuries BC, the Eastern Mediterranean experienced what historians call the Bronze Age collapse. States disappear, trade systems collapse, and cities fall into decline. But Sardinia is almost untouched by this catastrophe. While old connections were collapsing in the east, they continued to function in the west. Moreover, it was during this time that Nuragic Sardinia entered its true golden age. The economy was already established, trade routes were set up, and craftsmanship was developed, and all of this began to be reflected in the architecture. Whereas the Nuraghis had previously been relatively simple and functional, they were now rapidly becoming more complex. Classical tower Nuraghis appear, tall, massive, with inner chambers, staircases, and domed ceilings, but it doesn't stop there. Multi-tower complexes with inner courtyards and additional buildings are being built more and more often. These were no longer just strongholds for communities, but real stone centers of regional significance. Settlements grew around such Nuraghis, houses crowded at the foot of the towers, craft areas, farm plots, and livestock pens took shape. The Nuraghi became the core around which life revolved. Sardinia still did not have a capital that dictated rules to the whole island. Instead, we see a hierarchy without a state. Some Nuraghis became larger, more complex, and more influential, while others remained local. Regional systems emerge where large complexes dominate smaller ones, drawing them into their orbit. This is clearly visible in the distribution of resources. Metallurgy, agriculture, and trade are concentrated around the most developed centers. Where there is access to resources and routes, Nuraghis grow and become more complex, while in places with more modest conditions, the architecture remains simple. It is also interesting that during this period, Nuragic structures begin to resemble similar buildings on neighboring islands, in Corsica and the Balearic Islands. This is evidence of close contacts within the Western Mediterranean. When the Nuragic civilization enters its period of flourishing, the question is no longer whether there was a complex society here, but rather how exactly it was organized. Archaeology gives us enough data to talk about the structure, but it gives us almost no names or titles. Let's start with what can be stated confidently. The foundation of Nuragic society was kinship communities, connected by ancestry, land, and collective memory. This can be seen in the layout of settlements, where there are houses, work areas, and collective burials around the Nuraghis. All of this forms a closed social world, where the living and the dead exist as part of a single structure. Now let's talk about what can be reconstructed based on the information we already have. The scale and complexity of some Nuraghs clearly go beyond the efforts of a single family. This means that within the society there were people with higher status, those who could organize labor, control resources, and make decisions. But who were they? Unfortunately, archaeology does not provide a direct answer. We don't see crowns, thrones, or inscriptions with titles. That's why researchers talk not about kings, but about local elites. They could have been elders, military leaders, trade controllers, or keepers of rituals. Most likely, power was not strictly hereditary and was not separated from the community. The leader existed within the collective, not above it. A separate question is whether there were specialized groups in Nuragic society, such as warriors, priests, and craftsmen. There is no direct evidence of a caste system, but indirect signs such as differences in burials, the concentration of bronze figurines in sanctuaries, and the reinforced defense of certain Nuraghis indicate a functional division of roles. In other words, it was a society where some were engaged in warfare, others in crafts, and others in ritual, but the boundaries between them remained blurred. That is, functions could be combined and changed depending on the situation. Thus, Nuragic Sardinia represents a rare example of a complex society without states. This world consists of clans and communities linked by a network of centers, where authority outweighs titles and resource control matters more than formal power. We know for sure that there was no empire here. We reconstruct the existence of elites. But exactly how they negotiated among themselves is one of the most intriguing questions, to which the Nuragic civilization has not given us a direct answer. We know less about the religion of the Nuragic people than about any other aspect of their lives. They had no written texts, myths, attested gods, or priestly codes. But at the same time, it was the sacred sphere that left behind some of the most striking and unusual monuments of the Nuragic civilization. One of the key themes of their world was water. Sanctuaries connected to springs, wells, and underground waters have been found all over Sardinia. These structures were built with the same engineering precision as the Nuraghis. And water here was not just a resource, but a boundary between worlds, something that connects the earth, the depths, and the sacred. Near the springs, a special complex is found, which researchers sometimes call ritual baths or saunas. Their location, architecture, and the finds inside indicate that they were not intended for everyday use, but served a ritual function. Another important element is the cult of ancestors. Collective burials, monumental tombs, and the repeated use of ancient graves suggest that the past played an active role in the present. Ancestors did not disappear, they remained part of the community. Through them, the right to land, family memory, and probably social status were established. Bronze figurines hold a special place as some of the most recognizable artifacts of Nuragic culture. Among them are warriors, figures with weapons, characters in horned helmets, bearded men, and female figures. We don't know exactly whom they depicted, gods or real people, but the very fact of their widespread presence in the sanctuary points to a developed system of offerings. And again, they are closely connected. And again, apparently, the Nuragic people did not have a unified religion. Different regions of the island had their own sanctuaries and possibly their own deities. There were common motifs, but the cult remained local and tied to a specific place. Religion in this world complemented power. Where status could not be established by writing or title, it was affirmed through participation in ritual. And it was precisely this system that allowed humanity to remain stable even without a state, laws, or a written tradition. Around the 10th century BC, an important shift occurred in the Nuragic world. It is immediately noticeable by one sign. New Nuraghis were almost no longer being built. This might look like the beginning of decline, but archaeology tells us the opposite. Instead of building new towers, there was a massive reconstruction of the old ones. The Nuraghis were reinforced, built up, their interiors made more complex, and their defenses improved, while the focus of public life was also shifting. The number of offerings in sanctuaries throughout the Nuragic world increases sharply. Bronze figurines, weapons, vessels, and status items accumulate in ritual centers. This indicates competition among the elites. Power is increasingly demonstrated not through construction, but through ritual, generosity, prestige, and visible participation in the sacred sphere. At the same time, the hierarchy of settlements becomes more noticeable. Some Nuraghis clearly stand out in size, complexity, and appearance. Others remain secondary. Unique large centers are formed. The military aspect also changes. Some Nuraghis are given thicker walls and reinforced towers. This indicates an increase in tension both between the Nuragic centers themselves and possibly with the outside world. Contacts across the Mediterranean do not disappear, but they become more competitive. By the time the Nuragic civilization enters the early Iron Age, Sardinia has long ceased to be isolated. But now the nature of these contacts begins to change. The first to appear on the island's coasts are the Phoenicians. They are primarily interested in convenient harbors, river mouths, and trade routes. They establish coastal trading posts, which gradually turn into cities. For a long time, the Phoenicians and the Nuragic people coexist. One group controls the coast and maritime trade, while the other controls the inland areas, resources, and traditional power structures. Contacts include trade, employment, and mixed settlements. The situation begins to change with the rise of Carthage. In the second half of the 8th century, BC interest in Sardinia is no longer purely commercial. The island comes under direct control. The Carthaginians launch military expeditions, establish themselves in the southern and western regions, gradually subjugating the coastal areas. Thus, for the first time, Nuragic Sardinia encounters an external power. Meanwhile, the island's inner regions stay beyond Carthaginian control for a long period. The Nuragic communities continue to exist, adapting to the new conditions, but the world around them was already changing. Trade routes increasingly bypass the old centers, and the new rules are dictated by those who control the sea. The Roman period becomes decisive. After the First Punic War, Sardinia comes under Roman rule. The Romans established themselves on the coasts and in the cities, while the inland areas continue to live by the old rules for a long time. Nuragic settlements continue to exist, albeit in a changed form. The towers are rebuilt, adapted, used as warehouses, fortifications, landmarks, and sometimes as residential buildings. Stone remains a part of everyday life, even when its original meaning fades away. The process of Latinization stretches over centuries. Even in the Roman era, ancient authors noted that inland Sardinia was very different from the coastal areas. Old ways of life, customs, and social structures are preserved there, but gradually the Nuragic system loses its integrity. Old trade networks break down, and local centers lose their influence and former role. By the beginning of the Common Era, the Nuragic civilization ceases to exist as a separate world. But it remained in stone and in the unique character of Inner Sardinia, which can still be felt even today. The Nuragic people are an excellent example of an alternative path of development, where a complex society can exist without a center, without an empire, and without writing. Their history reminds us that the ancient world was much more diverse than we might have assumed. It often seems that Europe began to take shape long before Rome, not only through conquests, but also through stable local civilizations. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye, everyone.